But this talk is called Do Zombies Have a Self? And it is building on my previous work, which is sort of a first principles approach to initially AI and led into consciousness. And so I'm presenting something else at ASSC, which is about what is consciousness. So it's sort of a mathematical formalism, unifying lower and higher order theories of consciousness. And then an argument about type, which is a separate result based on the first. And this is interesting for states of consciousness because it explains consciousness in terms of constructed cells and scale. And then we can ask questions about what happens when we alter these constructed cells. So these constructed cells sort of goes through this process of scaling up this ability to learn weak policies, which I'll briefly describe. But there's a first order self, which is functionally equivalent to reafference. The second order self, which is like access consciousness, and the third order self, which is sort of meta self-reflexive stuff you don't need to worry about for the sake of this talk. What happens if we alter these selves? Do we get dissociative states or altered states of mind? And so I want to speculate a bit about what that might look like in terms of some visual representations of the math. So to get to that point, I want to first explain how we get to these constructed cells. And this is sort of a 5-step process. We start by unifying pan-computationalism and inactivism. So this is sort of the first principles part. Then we formalize fit organisms in terms as a sort of constraint on behavior. Then we get sample-efficient adaptation, which is where the computer science part comes in, because my main PhD result is about how to get optimally sample-efficient learning. So you adapt from as few examples as possible. And that's all in the context of an embodied, inactive formalism of intelligence that has some experiments associated with it. And then we scale up evolutionary pressures, which has this sort of relevance realization aspect to it, learning cause and effect. And that is where we get the constructed cells, and then we can talk about what happens when we alter them. So quickly, on the pan-computational inactive approach, we start with discarding assumptions like objects and variables and quantities, which is anathema to a good computer scientist's approach. But then we start with just there are things. And where we have the things, we call those things the environment. And where things differ, we have different states of the environment. And so from a sort of inactive point of view, we could say that something is different. This might be a difference in quality, but ultimately we have a difference in state, and there's not a quantity or anything like that. And in pan-computational terms, this difference could be considered it allows us to construct declarative programs, because if we take any set of these states, well, that's the states in which this declarative program returns true. And so in that context, we can take any set of declarative programs and say, well, that's a body. It's a constraint on quality or a constraint on which declarative programs exist. And an embodied organism would then imply a formal language of declarative programs or quality with different statements that are true in different states. And that allows us to formalize cognition. So then we could say that a fit organism is the extension of fit behavior for that body. That's all the circumstances in which the body remains alive. We say an organism is a policy because it is a constraint on behavior, but it also, if it's a learning organism, uses or constructs a policy. It is a policy that constructs a policy. And a policy constrains behavior, so it constrains how quality is processed. And so we could say a fit policy commits only fit behavior, or tracks an organism towards qualities that are associated with survival as opposed to death. And adaptation is then inferring a policy from examples of fit behavior, as in the experience of the organism so far that has been pleasant, in order to construct a policy that generalizes to the extension of fit behavior. And that's how we sort of formalize learning. So in that context, there's a whole lot of formal stuff we don't need to go into, but you can sort of think of the organism as this big circle on the left, the possibilities for behavior given a set of inputs or situations, this big circle on the right, and what actually happens sort of in a machine functionalist terms as output area, this intersection here. And where we have that, if that intersection contains only fit behavior, then the organism survives. We then say generalization. Well, in the same way that a hammer can be both a weapon and a paperweight, the same policy can address two different tasks, and we can generalize from narrower tasks to broader tasks, that is, learn the extension of fit behavior from very narrow examples that are. Now, how does this get us to adaptation? Well, there's some math that goes on in the background. Ultimately, this was something called minimum description length principle versus something I call weakness. Minimum description length turns out to be entirely subjective in what it does. Complexity turns out to be a byproduct of abstraction layers. We discard that particular notion, go for weak policies instead, get much higher rates of generalization. Experiments just blew away the previous state of the art, which was a happy day. But how does this get us to constructed selves? Well, if we're able to do optimally sample efficient learning, then we can identify the most likely cause or cause of behavior, or the program that generated the sequence. And to know that I cause something, I must have a concept of I. If you're familiar with anything from Judea-Pearl, do calculus, or the causal inference stuff, this is a substitute for a do operator. So rather than using this do operator, we construct variables or construct what I call causal identities to represent the objects in the world. This is the process of relevance realization in the parlance of enactivism. So once we do that, I won't go into the specifics because of time constraints, we get to constructing causal identities for oneself and for other things in the environment. Which brings us to the construction of selves. So a first order self is very similar to Pearl's do operator. This is where we're distinguishing between the effect of my actions and my passive observation of events. So you can think of it like a fly on your shoulder as the classic example. So the fly might see the room move around it. That could be caused by my moving my shoulder or the fly having moved. Reafference allows it to distinguish between these two events. And this policy amounts to the same thing. I didn't know about reafference when I came up with this, actually. It was only after I published the initial results that one of my supervisors, who's a philosopher at the ANU, pointed out that there was this thing called reafference. So I started looking into this guy named Bjorn Merker from 20 years ago, and apparently there's this whole argument about subjective experience being centered on reafference. That a whole wealth of literature that proved to be very helpful for my thesis. And so it's quite helpful to realize that I come to the same conclusion as someone else from completely different premises, which made it feel more plausible. To get to a second order self, though, we just continue to scale up that ability to construct weak policies. So this is kind of interesting because it's like I have a first order self, I'm interacting with this causal identity I've constructed with something else, and then when I'm predicting this in enough detail, and if I'm in a situation where, say I'm dealing with predators, and I'm trying to evade predators, so I feint left. I'm essentially simulating their prediction of what I'm going to do in order to trick the predator. So this is, basic sort of theory of mind stuff. No obvious connection to consciousness from the get-go, but then you consider that access consciousness is typically defined as contents which are communicable, which are available to communication. And access consciousness is also often sort of associated with things like just available. I think that there's a conflict in this definition. Because if we look at, say, there's a language philosopher, Grice, who said that meaning is when I predict your prediction of what you want me to think. And this second order self, in computational terms, allows you to make that inference. So I argue that this is where access consciousness bit needs to be. It's not just access to information, it has to be the contents of second order selves if we want it to be communicable in the same way that humans are able to communicate intendedly. And the computer is not access conscious by this definition. So then it's sort of, you could also say it's self-awareness, but what's also interesting is the way this is reflected off another thing in the environment. So this is your predicted self as perceived by someone else, which also explains things like attention, why we have different perceptions of the self when we interact with others, if this holds. So with that in mind, the result I'm presenting at ASSC is about why nature doesn't like zombies. Well, this would be why nature doesn't like zombies. It has a second order self, but not a first by this definition. So there'd be no reason for that to arise. It'd be a very strange occurrence. But for the purpose of our discussion, what happens if we start to break these cells apart? Well, we could have a situation where, say we have two different first order cells because we get such negative feedback, or there's just something in the wiring that makes it difficult to unify experiences associated with intervention. So we get two different senses of agency, two different phenomenal consciousnesses. And in second order cells, we can get much the same thing. If the feedback and the circumstances are such that we can't quite create one unified policy to explain the experiences that have been in the past, we could end up with two separate second order cells. And I'm speculating here. This is just what might happen if we altered the inputs to this model. And I'm speculating about how this might correlate with things we see in humans. So then we could have, essentially two different consciousnesses in the same body. But what if we looked at something like derealization? How might that work for a foggy or unreal experience? Would that be a broken first order self with two different senses of agency? Could we have some sort of held together with a fragmented but still coherent second order self? How might that work? It's very speculative at the moment, so bear with me if I've said anything wrong. And dissociative amnesia as well would just be, well, if access consciousness is the contents of second order cells, then we could just break it apart, have it disconnected from the first order self, which connects all these memories together, and have it on its own, off in the wilderness, unavailable for communication. And then we get to depersonalization, which I find particularly fascinating because it's like you're watching yourself from afar, which often how it feels when I'm trying to give a talk. This is where your first order self is sort of looking at some other object in the environment, reflecting back onto an entirely disconnected second order self. You've got this sense of agency and control over here, but then the awareness is over here. So it'd be like someone else is piloting your body. Then finally, I got into multi-scale competency architectures when I listened to too much Michael Levin. And then we get to this, contentless or selfless consciousness. So if we keep weakening abstractions to try and be more and more adaptable, we eventually get to nothing, a statement of that's completely useless. If you go beyond what is sufficient for a task and just keep the weakest policy is the empty set. So if you are sitting there trying to meditate, is that weakening representations of self if you experience a selfless state, if you experience this sort of contentless consciousness? I had someone reach out to me after I put out a preprint last year who was Buddhist, who started talking to me about this sort of second arrow stuff and losing the concept of like rivers and mountains and trees. And I got really interested in that because that works with this. We could let go of causal identities, just make them so weak they don't actually function as an indicator of anything. But that would leave you in a state where you're flexible and able to adapt to new situations afterwards, which sort of correlates with this anecdotal description of the experience. And then with the MCA stuff, well, we could disconnect high-level abstractions by sort of dropping Hume's guillotine, because everything I've described so far is very teleological. What happens if we just embody our high-level abstractions in silico? Is that something like a zombie? Thanks very much.